Hey, physiology class, welcome to lecture 2 on muscle physiology. So I'm going to share the screen. Okay, the last time that we were in lecture for this chapter, we covered different muscle types in the body, muscle anatomy, different types of muscle fibers, definition of the neuromuscular junction, and then we looked into the sliding and filament theory of muscle contraction, including the role of ATP and ADP. Okay, so today we're talking about what affects muscle contractile strength. And we talk about this because the laboratory that we ran this week was looking at muscle contractile strength and how it differs between your non-dominant and dominant hand, how it differs between your fingers. And then we looked at muscle fatigue when we looked at contractile force over a long period of time. So muscle contractile force depends on the motor neuron and all the muscle fibers that it is attached to. So in this image, we have a nerve that's connected to 1, 2, 3 muscle fibers. And so the amount of force that those 3 fibers can produce is what the motor unit can produce. Now, there's a different arrangement of motor units depending on, are they motor units controlling your legs or your torso, or are they motor units controlling your fingers? Because the more muscle fibers a motor unit is stimulating, it can produce a lot of force, but you can't get fine control or precise control. Okay, so we're going to look at the power versus precision principle. So if you want muscle precision, that motor unit is going to be here shown in blue, one nerve, motor nerve, connected to few muscle fibers. Here we see a motor unit of 2 fibers. That won't produce a lot of force, but that nerve will have very good precision over those muscle groups. Now, if we want power, like the muscles that are in your legs and in your torso, here shown in red, this nerve is connected to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 muscle fibers. This motor unit is going to produce a lot more power, but the offset is there won't be good precision control of those muscles. So that's the muscle precision versus power principle. Okay, so let's continue looking at muscle contractile strength based on something similar we were just talking about. The more fibers that respond, the more force is produced. Okay, so if we look down here, motor unit Y connects to 7 fibers. It's going to produce more force if you look at the graph on the x-axis here and the y-axis compared to motor unit X, which is connected to only 5 fibers. So if we follow over to the tension, it's going to produce less force. Okay, so fewer fibers, less force is produced. Now, another thing that affects how much force is produced is the strength of the stimulus. So if the strength is very strong, and that can be interpreted that there is a lot of acetylcholine released into the synapse with those muscle fibers, you get much more force. As opposed to if there's only a little acetylcholine released, that's a weak stimulus and less force is produced. Okay, so we went back through this back in chapter 4.1. We were talking about a graded potential where it's the amount of stimulus, the amount of neurotransmitter released that depends and will determine the response of the cell. Now, let's say you need to generate enough force, but a single motor unit is not enough. What can happen is you can get recruitment of multiple motor neurons in all the muscle fibers it connects to. And the force that they produced combined in cooperation will be much greater than either motor unit alone. So if we combine motor units X and Y, they have a combined 12 fibers that they stimulate, and the amount of force that they produce is much, much greater than either motor unit alone. Okay, so recruitment. Now, you can also change muscle contractile force with how frequently is that muscle fiber being stimulated. So if you just have one stimulation, just one single stimulation once, every time you get a single muscle twitch, And if it's very infrequent, like stimulus, muscle contraction, and you wait a little longer, then another stimulus, another muscle contraction, they produce a small amount of force. If you increase the frequency at which the muscle fibers are stimulated, they will respond in kind. So, if you look at this graph, which is called muscle trip, this is pretty much how our muscles work. So, after repeated low frequency stimulus, each muscle contractile force goes up. So, this first little black line represents the first stimulus, and you produce this much force. Then the muscle has time to relax, and then it's stimulated again. It contracts again, producing slightly higher force before relaxing back to baseline again. And you see, as this muscle keeps getting stimulated, it keeps going up in force until eventually it's going to reach a plateau where it can't increase substantially anymore. This is called muscle prep. It's muscle warm up. And this is why we need to warm up our muscles, because they actually perform better when you have frequent low frequency stimulation, like stimulation, stimulation, stimulation. Every time the muscle contracts, it produces a little more force until it reaches a plateau. But notice it's stimulated at a frequency that's low enough that it has time to relax and come back to baseline in between each stimulus. Now, you can produce more force if you frequently stimulate higher than this, such that the muscle doesn't have time to relax. And that's called summation, where the frequency, look at the little black lines, is a stimulus. It's like stimulation, 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 stimulation. The force goes up, but notice in between the stimuli, it doesn't have time to relax and go back to baseline. So the muscle will go up until it reaches a maximal force. But if you keep pushing muscles at this high frequency of stimulation, they will produce lactic acid and they will fatigue, like the lab experiment in muscle physiology where you grip the dynamometer for 100 continuous seconds. Now, that produces a good amount of force, but not maximal force that a muscle is capable of. The maximal force a muscle is capable of is produced by muscle tetanus, where the frequency of stimulation is really fast, like stim, 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 stim. The muscle immediately, almost immediately, goes up to maximal plateau of force produced before that muscle gives out. So think of the people at the gym that are bench pressing a high weight, big weight, and they have a spotter because they're lifting so much mass that the muscles can do it, but you almost go into immediate muscle tetany where if you keep trying to push them, they're going to give out on you. And that's why there's a spotter there, because when you have complete muscle fatigue, they stop working. Okay. So we've talked about this before when we've talked about the central nervous system and everything, but sometimes when you're falling asleep, just before you get to REM sleep, some people will have a sudden involuntary muscle contraction, either their arms or their feet, and that's called a myoclonus or a myoclonic jerk, but the full name is a hypnagogic massive jerk. And so basically, as your muscles are being inhibited in your brain by GABA, there's a shift from you having voluntary control of your muscles to GABA basically incapacitating your skeletal muscles. And sometimes when you're just at that threshold between non-REM and REM sleep, you'd be like this cat who is twitching in their dream. Okay, that's called a myoclonus. That all that activity is the cat's asleep, but the GABA has not had a chance to fully paralyze those skeletal muscles yet. Okay, so I'm sure we've all experienced that. Okay, so we've gone over some information here, but we're going to continue on and go and talk about muscle fatigue, which, if you participated in that laboratory on muscle physiology, you certainly experienced it with 100 seconds of continuous grip. So, when your muscles are getting fatigued, you're depleting your oxygen stores, you're depleting your stores of ATP and glycogen, which is a storage form of glucose in your skeletal muscles. And you're also depleting the muscle's respiratory pigment known as myoglobin. What you accumulate is CO2 waste. You accumulate ADP. You build up lactic acid in your muscles and you accumulate phosphates because as ATP is being used up, it goes to a lower energy molecule called ADP. When ADP is used up, it's only got two phosphates left. It uses up a phosphate and it's adenosine monophosphate. So basically, to create energy, you've got to add phosphates to the system. So, speaking of lactic acid buildup, what removes lactic acid from the bloodstream? Because if it were to remain there, it would make the blood pH acidic. So this goes back to chapter 2, part 1, cell metabolism. And if you guessed the Cori cycle, which is happening in the liver, you'd be correct. Okay, so let's think about ATP, ADP, and the loss of energy as your skeletal muscles become fatigued. In our muscle, we have phosphocreatine, and you need it to convert ADP back into ATP. So the phospho in phosphocreatine means phosphate. So this helps add the lost phosphate back to ADP and takes it from adenosine diphosphate to adenosine triphosphate. Okay, so this is constantly happening. Okay, you use up ADP, and then to restore ATP, you need another phosphate. Okay, what's the nursing application of this? Well, in our skeletal muscle, our brain, and our heart, we have an enzyme called creatine phosphokinase, abbreviated CK or CPK. And you need this enzyme to convert creatine into phosphocreatine. And you need that to restore ATP, its extra phosphate that it lost. So let's talk about the implication of CPK. In these organs, skeletal muscle, brain, and heart, since it has this enzyme, if you have elevated isoforms of this enzyme, it can indicate that there's been a loss of blood supply or damage to these tissues. So if you see increased isoform of CPK MM, that is associated with diseased skeletal muscle. And we'll look at the clinical app online. Okay, so maybe muscular dystrophy. If you see CPK isoform BB, so when I think BB, I think all brain, okay, as opposed to MM, I think all skeletal muscle. So if you have damage to the brain, such as which happens with a stroke, you might see elevated isoforms of this in the blood. And lastly, CPK isoform MB elevates in association with damaged heart tissue. All right, so if we look at the clinical app online, we'll make it bigger here. Different organs, when they're diseased, liberate isoenzymatic forms of CPK. So, MM is from diseased skeletal muscle, BB, damaged brain, and MB from diseased heart. Okay? All right. Now, here's a graph. I'm sorry it's not as clear as I'd like, but the red line is showing elevated levels of a CPK isoform. It doesn't say what it is right here, but they're also showing LDH, which is lactate. Okay, so lactate is produced when a tissue runs out of oxygen and resorts to anaerobic respiration. It makes just a little bit of ATP and lactic acid as a byproduct. Okay, so both CPKs and lactate in the blood can indicate a tissue is gone, become damaged from lack of oxygen supply. Okay, so muscle tissue can be damaged. And in a daily basis, if it's not a disease process, muscles have stem cells called satellite cells, which repair and replace injured muscle. Now, for every action, there's an opposite reaction. Myostatin will inhibit satellite cells. So it's a balance of growth and inhibition of that growth. Now, it's known that elderly people have high myostatin levels in their blood, and that might be associated with some of the muscle loss or muscle atrophy that can happen with age. But we've come a long way, and if people are healthy and they can exercise, some moderate weight training can actually prevent this muscle atrophy as you age. Now, when myostatin is inhibited, you get overgrowth of muscle. And so that can happen in people, can be a genetic defect. It can also happen in animals. And so in these animals, they've got myostatin blocking, and you can see that they've got excessive growth of their skeletal muscles. Now, you might think this is great, right? You'd be bulked up, but this is actually a bad condition. This excess mass of the skeletal muscles actually puts too much stress on the joints and can start premature arthritis and joint breakdown. So, you don't want inhibition of myostatin too much. Okay, let's talk about some vocabulary with muscle disorders. Muscle atrophy, like I said before, is the shrinkage of muscle tissue. It can happen if you simply don't use your skeletal muscles. Anything that's not used is going to atrophy. If you've broken a bone and had it immobilized in a cast for somewhere from 6 to 10 weeks or longer, that muscle is going to atrophy, and it's going to take physical therapy after the cast is off to regain that muscle. You could also have injury or disease of muscle uh, that can cause atrophy. And if you have nerve damage to muscles, they can atrophy simply because they're not being stimulated. So in this image, the right leg is normal size skeletal muscle. And on the left, this person had broken bone, they had a cast on, and in the time that it was immobilized, they lost muscle mass. So, muscle spasms are basically uncontrolled muscle convulsions. So, this GIF shows a boy who's got muscle spasms, okay, these little seizures that happen. Now, a muscle cramp is usually after heavy exercise, heavy, muscular exercise and lactic acid buildup. And what will happen is you get what's called like a Charlie horse. And here we can see a guy's calf showing that. I think we've all experienced that. It's quite painful. So often, if you have those kind of muscle cramps, rehydrating with an electrolyte solution like Gatorade or Pedialyte or just something that has some salts and sugar in it is better than just plain water. Okay, a muscle sprain is a joint injury in which a ligament is overstretched or actually torn. So, a common example of this is an ACL tear, a tear in the anterior cruciate ligament. So, right here, well, actually, they're showing the posterior cruciate ligament, but regardless, it's actually gotten torn. And if it is torn, it's usually a surgical repair. If it is just being stretched or strained or sprained, the treatment for it is rice. Rest that joint, ice it, compress it with a bandage, and elevate it so you take your weight off of it. That's for a stretched ligament, not for a torn one. Now, a muscle strain is actually a pulled muscle where the muscle is overstretched or it's actually torn. Okay, so here's a muscle that's actually got a tear in it. And those can heal, but they also might require surgical intervention. Now, a muscle clonus is usually caused by problems with motor neurons. There's a lesion on them or something. It could be a problem in the brain. So, things included in this are multiple sclerosis, where there's a loss of myelin sheaths on neurons, cerebral palsy, Huntington's disease, and brain and spinal cord injuries, including stroke. And so, we're going to look at a GIF here of someone who's got a clonus in the muscles going to their foot. And when they put resistance on that foot, you get that trembling. That's called a clonus. That's abnormal activity. That's usually motor neuron damage. Another muscle disorder is dermatomyositis. It's a myopathy. Myo means muscle, and pathy means pathology. And in this condition, they get muscle weakness that progresses over time. It tends to affect the muscles close to the trunk. That means like your legs close to the hip and your arms close to the shoulder, and also causes skin rashes. So the treatment is to take anti-inflammatory drugs. There are steroidal anti-inflammatories like prednisone, and then there are NSAIDs, which stands for non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, something like ibuprofen or Tylenol. And then they also get treated, they should wear sunscreen to protect their inflamed hands. Okay. Muscular dystrophy. The most common form is Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. It's a sex-linked recessive disorder, and it's found in males more because it's carried on the X chromosome. So a male child expresses whatever on the X chromosome because the only other one they have is 6 chromosomes is the Y. Okay, the onset happens early in children and they lose muscle strength, usually starting with their legs and their torso and arms. And when they start losing leg strength, they can't walk or move normally, and so they end up in a wheelchair. And we still don't know exactly what's going on with muscular dystrophy, this form, but it's thought to be a problem with dystrophin, a protein that you need for normal muscle function. Now, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, abbreviated as ALS, is where the muscle is fine, but the motor neurons are degenerating. And without the being stimulated, the muscles will atrophy. And eventually, it starts in your hands, your extremities, okay? And then it progresses up your arms, and then it starts going after the legs, and then it starts on the torso, and eventually it goes after the respiratory muscles, which will usually be towards the end of someone's life who's diagnosed with this disease. Um, Life expectancy after diagnosis is usually 5 years or less. Now, I have a picture of Stephen Hawking here because he was diagnosed with ALS, but he survived for decades longer than the prognosis given him was, and we still don't know why. But we still need to know a lot about this disease. There is hypotheses that it's about the loss of an antioxidant called superoxide dismutase. It's also thought to be an excess of the stimulatory neurotransmate called glutamate. Um, and so there's a clinical app, and I'm not going to go over it in this video, but on my webpage, if you're looking at this PowerPoint, you can look at it. Okay, continuing with muscle disorders. Myasthenia gravis is where your immune system attacks acetylcholine receptors, and it's not just the nicotinic ones on your skeletal muscles, it will also go after the muscarinic ones on the heart and smooth muscle. And what happens is the antibodies are these little green Y-shaped things shown here, and they are degrading the receptor. And without a receptor, acetylcholine can't stimulate the muscle. So what happens over time is you get muscle weakness. Now, the treatment for this is to uh, give people immunosuppressants to slow down the immune attack on the body. But that comes with the caveat that, well, you're immunosuppressed, which makes you more vulnerable to things like a cold or the flu, or for God's sakes, COVID. Okay, and review from chapter 4, part 1. Know what tetanus does and botulism does to skeletal muscle function. And since this is a review, I'm not going to spend time going over it here. Okay, this is a good place to end the second lecture on muscle physiology. So I'm going to stop the share and